Good evening, everyone. Yeah, it's working. I'm Jonathan Brent. It's really a great privilege to be able to introduce this evening's program that features stars Eddy Portnoy, who is academic advisor for the YIVO Institute. He is a specialist in Yiddish popular culture, and whenever anyone at YIVO is sort of down, they stroll into his office and they hear a good joke. And in any case, Eddy is a beloved person at YIVO and known, I'm sure, to many of you already. This is going to be a great program with Luke Sante and Alana Newhouse to join Eddy in discussion a little bit later. But let me tell you a little something first about the YIVO Institute. Over this past month, we've had programs that have ranged from the new discovery of lost Holocaust materials to the 120th anniversary of the Bund, to the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and we find ourselves tonight talking about the bad rabbi. What has this world come to? What has YIVO come to? And to answer that, I will invite Eddy Portnoy up here to explain.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'd like to thank YIVO, all my colleagues here who have helped out tonight. I really appreciate everything. Of course, Alana and Luke. And all of you. Thanks so much for coming out. So most Jewish history books are not about abortionists, murderers, rioters, prostitutes, bigamists, drunks, extortionists, psychics, and charlatans. But this one is. There's a guy named Rosenzweig who accidentally kills a woman and decides that rather than dispose of her body properly in New York, where he lives, that it's a better idea to pack her body in a trunk and mail it to Chicago. Then there's Pesach Rubenstein, who in 1875 decides to murder his housekeeper/cousin/lover because he got her pregnant and found out his wife was on her way to New York from Poland. There's also the 1929 pageant to choose the most beautiful Jewess in Poland that erupts in a scandal that engulfs all of Jewish Warsaw and which finally devolves into a giant brawl at a funeral during which people screamed and beat each other with blocks of wood as the body of a well-known rabbi was lowered into the ground. In other words, it's just another day in Yiddish land. Jewish history, like most other history, is largely about elites. Rabbis, scholars, writers, artists, politicians, business people, and their ilk rightly fill the rosters of our history books. There's also been a more recent focus on social history, but that also tends toward an upwardly mobile trajectory. Yes, there are a lot of Jewish success stories, but what about the downwardly mobile? What about the failures? Where are the blockheads, the bunglers, or the just plain weird in Jewish history? Marginal figures really don't appear very often in Jewish history books. Scholars haven't taken much interest in Yiddish-speaking sideshow performers, professional wrestlers, or pickpockets. But Yiddish journalists did take an interest. Their stories fill the pages of Yiddish daily newspapers, the first form of mass media among Jews, and one of the only places you can find Jews of all kinds, from brilliant scientists to circus freaks, from rabbis and scholars to tattoo artists and drag queens. The best and worst of everything appear on the same inky pages, sandwiched together among announcements for public debates on the existence of God and advertisements for post-Passover constipation products. And these among millions of other things you've never heard of. The late 19th or early 20th century heyday of the Yiddish press is a disjointed chronicle of Jewish urban life that tells us stories about our pasts that cannot be found anywhere else. While we'll never have anything close to a complete picture of the Yiddish world that was, dredging up even a little enriches our sense of it because it reveals how much we do not know. These forgotten stories offer a look at the seamy underbelly of Jewish urban life, a peek into the depths of Jewish poverty and insanity, into the frequently troubled world of migrants in big cities where any misstep is potential news. So what is the historical value of stories of the Yiddish lowlife? Since they're obviously not representative of Jewry at large, what do they reveal? In every society, some level of the populace is considered by those who do the record keeping of being lowly, uncultured, uneducated, poor, dangerous, frightening, ugly, and worthy of attention really only from a safe distance. And yet, even from a protracted historical distance, these Jews have something to say about themselves. They're easily stereotyped, yet they break the mold in which they're supposed to fit. The Jews we find in the Yiddish press are secular, they're religious, and they're a little bit of both. A sometimes complex mix of shtetl folklore and urban poverty, Yiddish-speaking city dwellers were often incredibly modern and yet sometimes backward and stupid. In short, they're a lot like everyone else. But most of all, they're not the Jews you expected. I want to briefly mention one of the ways in which I fell into this project. This book is essentially an accident. I didn't go looking for these stories, but stumbled into them during the course of doing research on other things. I spent many years right here in this building, and really it's a good opportunity to thank the archivists and librarians here who constantly brought me, all the fantastic material I was working with. But I spent many years looking at microfilms of Yiddish newspapers for my dissertation, which was on cartoons of the Yiddish press. When I was researching cartoons in Warsaw's Yiddish Daily, I discovered that cartoons only appeared in the Friday editions. So instead of scrolling through the microfilm, instead of scrolling through the entire week, I would turn the dial so I could jump from Friday to Friday and skip what was in the middle, essentially jumping over the whole week. One day I was looking at the Yiddish Daily Moment from 1929, skipping from Friday to Friday to steady clip, photocopying my cartoons, when I accidentally landed on the interior of a Thursday paper. The headline in front of me was, "Two Wives, Blazing Punches, and the Police." I thought to myself, okay, I'll bite. The story turned out to be about a Hasidic man in Warsaw known only as Avram Aleph. Avram Aleph fell in love with his wife's best friend, who he married and set up in an apartment outside of town, and then shuttled between the two women, telling the first that he was away on business when he was seeing the second. The couple's neighbors found out, they figured out what happened and told the man's brother, who was known to be fanatically religious. This brother dragged him to the Warsaw Rabbinical Court, where a panel of rabbis was waiting, along with both wives and about 30 members of the first wife's family. The verdict was that Avram had to divorce both women. After the rabbis read the verdict, making it official, Avram's brother ran over to him and punched him in the face. The 30 members of the first wife's family jumped on the second wife and began beating her mercilessly. The rabbis ran out, and the shamus called the police, who brought everyone to jail. I sat in front of the microfilm reader transfixed. And I don't know if any of you have ever used a microfilm reader. It's not usually transfixing. But in my years in graduate school, I had never come across Jews like this. And I thought to myself, there must be more stories like this. From that moment on, instead of skipping from Friday to Friday, I scanned slowly through the microfilms looking for headlines, and I wound up finding thousands of stories. And I found these stories everywhere, in New York's Yiddish papers as well. Take this short example from the Vorwärts, the largest and most important of the Yiddish papers, of September 19th, 1907. This is a holiday story. Yom Kippur services in a Clinton Street hall were disrupted due to a fight over a chair. When Joseph Rand showed up in school with his family, he discovered that one Herman Garber was sitting in one of the seats he had reserved. Rand informed Garber that he was in one of his seats, But Garber produced a ticket indicating that Rand was wrong and that it was, in fact, his seat. Rand responded by punching Garber in the face. Not to be outdone, Garber tore out part of Rand's beard. The lion-like voice of the cantor was drowned out by the screams and howls of the fighting congregants. In the end, both Rand and Garber were forced to finish the Musaf service in Essex Market Court, where they were both held under arrest. Now, this story, in a tiny, angry nutshell, is a fine metaphor for Jewish intra-ethnic relations. There really is a lot you can glean from the Yiddish press. And Bad Rabbi, as a whole, is a small attempt to retrieve some of the flotsam and jetsam of this Yiddish underworld, the stories of the Jewish two-bit nobodies who would have otherwise been completely forgotten. The Amcha, or the common Jewish rabble, also deserve their place in the historical record. Now I'd like to bring up Luke Sante and Alana Newhouse. Alana Newhouse is the editor of Tablet Magazine, editor-in-chief of Tablet Magazine, and Luke Sante is the author of the legendary Lowlife, Lures and Snares of Old New York, and more recently, The Other Paris. Thank you.
Hi.
Howdy.
Hello. Okay, so I have a question that you started to get at in your own talk, but I'd like you to flesh it out if you can a little bit, maybe even for my own benefit. What's the point in knowing these stories now?
The point is that it...
I don't mean like I'm here as a representative of the ADL and you can't say anything bad about Jews. I mean like, let's assume all these stories are true. What's the benefit to us now, historically?
The benefit is that these stories reveal an element of Jewish life that has heretofore been ignored. If historians only tell us the histories of successful Jews or of scientists, of writers, of politicians, of businessmen, we lose an enormous amount of our history. The reality is when Jews lived in Eastern Europe in large numbers, and when they lived on the Lower East Side as an immigrant generation, you had a culture that was a proletarian culture in a different time that produced all kinds of activity that no longer exists. And if you want history to show a much broader picture, you need these people in your history.
And so, and I want to turn this over to you too, but I guess I just had one other question to start with, which is, what are the stories that we're not telling now?
That is a very good question. I don't think I could accurately answer that. I mean, I'm sure societies always have stories that you never hear.
No, but I'm saying, what are the stories we're not telling about Jews?
Oh, I'm sure there are thousands of stories that we don't know. And one of the issues here also is that we no longer have a mass press in Yiddish, which, and I've said this before, the Yiddish press to a large degree was kind of a private conversation. Gentiles didn't read the Yiddish press, so you could really say whatever you wanted. Now that American Jews are completely English speaking,
they can hear us.
It's a completely different dynamic.
Right.
Their dirty laundry is open for all to see.
Right.
So it's not really clear to me what editors decide not to show, what writers decide not to write. I'm sure there's quite a lot.
Well, also, I mean, the world has changed in many ways, and one of them that we tend to forget about, maybe because it's so obvious, is that there's so many more people than there used to be. That means that in the past, the press whatever press it was that you're talking about, I mean, even, the major New York City newspapers were much more based in a community. And, the more fine-grained you got, if it was in a language that was not the dominant language of the country, the more likely was the press to represent a community, a neighborhood, really. I mean, community's also been one of these deracinated terms, but a neighborhood. It was something you might, easily know one of these people that you were reading about in the newspaper. It had this intimacy to it, which allowed for, this much more unbridled, less stuck up version of what the news represents now.
And also in a funny way, more trustworthy. Like, one of the things that I feel is that, right now we talk a lot about and I'm using this term generally, but people's mistrust of the media, whatever that is. But what you have to realize is 50 years ago, many people had a local reporter who they knew. That person was the media to them. The fact that they knew that person, even if they thought that person was a moron or a jerk, they still actually had a face, somebody who they knew. And that person meant their relationship to the concept of the media often flowed through a person they knew, and who knew them. And the fact that most people now don't know anybody who's a reporter, or a lot of people don't, unless you live in New York, it means that our relationship to these stories ends up being different, but also the filtering. I can't even imagine how you could, other than in an ethnic press, how you could get at this granular level of people's lives anymore. I mean, do you? Can you see how anybody could do this kind of mirroring?
Today, I think it would be strange and difficult because society is so disjointed. But what I can say historically is that Yiddish newspapers typically had bureaus that were open during certain times of the day where people could come in and tell their stories, make complaints.
I'm not doing that with Tablet, ever.
But this was a common thing, and you find articles in the Yiddish papers that, will say, Yetta Bernstein came into our offices and told us about the rent strike that's planned for, Tuesday on Clinton Street. And this is how things made news. People understood that they had a relationship to a certain newspaper, right, and could go into their offices and talk to them about it. It was, and this may well be, part of the reality of an ethnic press. It's a more closed society, or it's
right.
a closer society.
I think that the problem now is that we have Twitter.
That could, yes, they did not have Twitter.
Right, but also but Twitter is it's both distancing and I think anybody feels like they can complain or tell their story or pitch an outlet, but actually, in fact, it doesn't feel close at all.
No, I think with something like that, it just floats out into the air. And actually, I can say this: I made a complaint on Twitter last week. I was on an Amtrak train from Philadelphia to New York, and the Wi-Fi didn't work. And people say that if you complain on Twitter, sometimes you get results. So I made a complaint, and I got a response from Amtrak saying we're working on it. And I got no results, but I got a nice little note from Amtrak. It's sort of.
What's the moral of that story?
Twitter is just talking into the air. I don't think you get any
Okay.
results.
All right.
Another thing that's changed too is, I live in a small city up the Hudson. We have a local newspaper, and it's dull as dirt. It's 4-H club, it's school board meeting, it's some real estate transaction. But if people are hitting each other over the head with rolling pins in the street, which happens now and again, you won't read about it in a newspaper. Why? Because advertisers don't like that kind of thing.
Right.
And advertising pressure on editorial content is something that over the last 75 to 100 years has completely changed the face of newspapers. Now, of course, everything is so large-scaled that, becomes another thing altogether. But that was already going on, 50, 60, 70 years ago.
I'm also struck, I was hoping you might talk a little bit about, I was struck by how good some of the writing is.
Oh,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Not yours, I meant the newspapers.
I retract that.
Eddy's writing is great, by the way.
Yeah, Eddy's writing is terrific. And he's a tablet writer, come on, but I meant the newspaper, and for what other people would disdainfully look down on and say is tabloid journalism, the writing is terrific, and it's something that I think would shock a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I was hoping that you might talk a little bit about kind of the aesthetics of writing low, writing about stories like this and how you make it come alive.
Yeah.
Because, obviously it's something that you do incredibly well.
Well, I'm not a newspaper reporter, but one thing to be noted is that, of course, the Yiddish press was filled with people with genuine literary ambitions,
Right.
And a lot of people who write for newspapers want to be people who write for newspapers, not people who are writing drama or novels. But these people were poets, and it comes across, and they're not afraid to dramatize things, not afraid to interject emotion, not afraid to take sides in a way that would be frowned upon, if not altogether dismissed in today's climate.
Mm-hmm.
They have a great liberty at their disposal, and also in some cases shielded by anonymity, they can really go at it.
Right.
They were being paid a nickel a day, I'm sure, but they, on the other hand, had this completely untrammeled field to play in.
Yeah, the Yiddish press, obviously like any press, has great writers and mediocre writers, and people were shackled by deadlines. The paper has to come out every day, and some works were rendered really beautifully. You can find things by the Singer brothers that are amazing, and then you can find blurbs that are rendered in much more simple form that just tell very simple stories. But also in English, and getting back to this question, I think that if you look at newspapers in the United States from, let's say, 75, 80, 90 years ago, you have the quality of the writing, I think, is often better.
Yeah.
I don't know if people had more time, but when you're reading crime stories by Herbert Asbury or A.J. Liebling or
Yeah.
Joseph Mitchell, the feel is really different than what you see today. Even the sports writers, Dan Parker. You could think of sports writers from the 30s who are really phenomenal. It's a joy to read. I find it a joy to read these old newspapers. It's really the quality of the writing and the work is amazing.
I'm interested to hear what some of the questions from the audience may be, because I'm kind of fascinated by and I guess I'd like to hear what you think a contemporary audience gets out of this. Does it feel like it's a window into something authentic, something that feels like we don't have today, a kind of Jewishness that you feel people may be nostalgic for, a Jewishness where the prostitutes were Jewish, the pickpockets were Jewish, the firemen were Jewish, whatever that ideal is? Or is it because we are really reaching for a more accurate historical picture? Or what do you think?
I think at a certain level, it's some of those things and none of those things. I think that in the respect of nostalgia for something Jewish, I think that if you want Jewish pickpockets and prostitutes and police and firemen, you can go to Israel.
Right.
But what you have here is a different Jewish culture. You have Yiddish pickpockets. You don't really have so many Yiddish police, but there were some, certainly. But you have this sort of Yiddish world that is different from, it's like this rough and tumble Yiddish world that no longer exists. It's a mass culture that no longer exists. And I think that, there is, at a certain level, interest in the concept of tough Jews. Contemporary suburban, middle-class Jews like that idea. It's fun to read about, from your comfy couch. But it's also, it's also historical reality. And I think for people who are interested in history, getting back to your initial question, I think this is something that really completes, not necessarily completes, but adds a component to the historical record that hadn't been there previously.
Yeah, I'm struck by, as you were talking, I'm struck by something that Michael Weck said about the book, which is that these are people who are unconcerned with Gentile opinion, which I loved, and I sort of thought, I wonder if that would ever be true again of American Jews. Like, I wonder if we could ever create a situation where American Jews would be so internal, and I hate to use insular as a positive thing, but in some ways so maybe insulated is the way to phrase it, where the concerns would be the concerns of what other Jews think of you, not what the Gentiles think. Maybe that's part of what gives you this kind of richness.
I think in a way that it's, I think the people involved in these stories were not necessarily unconcerned with, specifically with Gentile opinion. I don't think they cared about what anybody thought. They're just doing what they do, and they just don't care. So, and there is, I think you have to be at a certain emotional, intellectual, cultural level to really be concerned with what people think of you. And in fact, what's interesting is in some of the bigger stories, you have instances where it's the people in the Yiddish press realize that either the Polish press or the English language press in New York is starting to write about these stories. They've gotten that out of control. And that's the point where the Jewish community sort of says, pull back, where this is too embarrassing for us. But the people involved don't care. They're there to perform. They're there to do what they're doing, and they do it.
Take audience questions because people have hands up.
We could. Sure, we could take some questions from the audience. Just Alex will come around to bring you the mic.
Thank you. Eddy, in your introductory comments, you used words like underbelly, downwardly mobile. What would you say are some of the social forces that were at work in New York and Warsaw in that period that created this segment of the Jewish population?
Well, each place has different aspects, but you're dealing with a community that is largely working class. In both places, you have the difficulties caused by migration. In Poland, it's internal migration towards the big city, and in New York, it's immigration. It's to New York. This is a type of upheaval that is very difficult to work with. And especially then, you're leaving friends and family who you'll probably never see again. That type of environment is extremely stressful. And when you're impoverished and you have all kinds of stress, whether it be the difficulties of immigration or the difficulties in getting a job or speaking the local language, or finding food that's adequate, all of these things contribute to this type of this type of underbelly, this world where Jews were part of this lower and working class world.
Eddy, I just want to thank you for. Is this on?
I can hear you.
I want to thank you for this book. It's just
Thank you.
really wonderfully entertaining. I saw you along with my husband and some friends at Parsons a year or so ago when you did the thing on the
Right, true. The
Could you repeat the question? This mic wasn't working.
we'll just play it back. So the yeah, I think you're right that this is material that upwardly mobile. Like if you'd looked at this material, from the New York papers, Jews who lived on Riverside Drive would be aghast at this type of behavior. There's no question. But one of the interesting things is when you were talking, it made me think of something Alana said earlier about what don't we know about today, what's not getting written about today, and it's known that there are still Jews in poverty today.
Yeah. And
that's not something that you read about very often or hear about very often. Obviously, there are lots of people in poverty, but it's, the Jewish community always has prided itself on taking care of its own, and I think that this is a case where, people have fallen through the cracks. So that's one instance of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, I wonder how the readers of the Yiddish press actually read these stories. Like, I wonder whether or not at some point what we would consider a middle of the road forward reader read these stories as curios, or read these stories as reflective of the people who they knew and reflective of a mass of them, which I think is important to understand because, for example, when Tablet published a story about Holocaust survivors living below the poverty level, most of my readers, or a lot of my readers who responded to it, responded like, A, I'd never heard that story, I can't believe it. B, there have to be only a few of them. Like, they didn't want to imagine that these were people who lived among them, and that it was too, I think it was too, it created too much internal conflict. So I wonder whether or not how a mainstream reader read these stories.
Right. I think that I think there's a lot of variation. I think that some people certainly read them and were embarrassed by them. Other people read them probably joyously. I think there's no question that these are enjoyable stories. I think that in a lot of cases, the journalists wrote them as directives as how not to behave. There's a certain moralizing tone in a lot of the articles, I think that there's wide variation among the readership. Like I said, some people were embarrassed, and other people just thought, I'll admit something here. When I was in graduate school, my fellow graduate students and I often watched the Jerry Springer Show, and we loved it. We thought it was amazing, and then of course there are people who watch it and love it for completely different reasons. So I think that you have many instances of similar attitudes.
Before the war in Poland, I'm thinking specifically of Poland, in Warsaw, when things started to stresses intensified, the anti-Semitism, intensified. Did you notice as you were reading these stories, these anecdotes, a shift of some kind, a change in both the actual events that were reported and in the writing itself? And the second part is connected to what was just talked about. Were there letters to the editor about these stories? Was there a reaction in the paper to them?
Just to add to the latter part of that is that there were sometimes letters to the editor, sometimes not. I mean, you're dealing with, millions of pages and millions of words. It's sometimes hard to find these things. As far as the anti-Semitism question goes, it's not something I addressed. The bulk of this work is Jew-on-Jew violence. And so I didn't want to include that element. So that's not part of this book. So when I was doing research, I didn't actually look for anti-Semitism as a phenomenon that might affect writing styles or articles.
But how many of these stories, I actually don't know now that I think about it, how many of these stories are post-war? Not many, right?
Only, I think only Blimp Levy is, the wrestler is post-war. And he's pre and post-war. He straddles it. That is him, yes. Some people have asked if it's me. It's not.
Do you think, be great, author photo on the front. Do you think that after the war, these stories started to seem silly?
I don't think they seemed silly. I think they do continue. For instance, if you read the Forwarts,
Right.
During and after war, you continue to have crime stories and scandals involving Jews. Obviously, the Jews of the world had gone through an enormous trauma, but that didn't stop journalists from reporting news. That remained. As long as these stories existed, they continue to report them.
Hi, Eddie. How do you think telling these stories can or should influence the way modern Jews conceptualize their ancestors?
I think it adds a different element to the way that contemporary Jews can conceive of their ancestors. It may not be, one of the odd things is I once gave a lecture on Pesach Rubenstein at the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And Pesach Rubenstein was the guy who I mentioned at the beginning who murdered his housekeeper / cousin / lover in 1875. And at the lecture, someone came up to me at the end and said, "Oh, I'm Pesach Rubenstein's great niece," and I was, I had never thought that someone that a descendant of one of these people would come up to me, but they did, and I was really kind of thrilled because she told me that there was all this family lore about how he murdered this other relative, and they didn't know much about it, and she thanked me for having done all this research, and it was, it's a very bizarre thing to have in your family history, and I think for a lot of people it would be enormously embarrassing, but she was clearly willing to accept it and live with it. It's not something that necessarily reflected poorly on her, just poorly on her great uncle or whatever he was exactly. But I think that this material is just it's added value to whatever people already know about history. And it's also a conduit into Jewish history for people who may not be interested in taking the traditional route of rabbis, scholars, business people, the things that we know the most about. So it just provides a different perspective that might be able to interest more people.
Hi. Did there tend to be many different reporters who wrote these, or I don't know if you correlated it this way, but is it possible there was a reporter assigned to these kind of stories, and maybe they ended up founding a National Enquirer later or something, but was it someone's job to go look for these loony stories?
No. So there are different instances of these types of stories, and there are lots of different kinds of stories. So, as one example, the Warsaw Rabbinical Court was a place that that editors would send reporters to because they knew that an interesting story was always unfolding before the rabbis. And lots of different reporters went there. So I know that Israel Joshua Singer reported from the Warsaw Rabbinical Court. This is Isaac Bashevis Singer's older brother. Isaac Bashevis Singer also reported from there. Bear Kutcher, another well-known reporter, sent reports from lots of reporters. First of all, there were 4 to 5 daily newspapers in Warsaw and New York during the teens and the 20s. So you have lots of reporters from different papers, visiting these locales and sussing out all kinds of different stories. For these different papers, so it's not just one guy who is interested in these stories, and I purposely use multiple papers in order to show the differences between the types of reporting and the reporters who did it.
Eddie, the story you just told about Pesach Rubinstein's grandniece echoed an experience I had at YIVO 20 years ago, 30 years ago actually, when Ed Koch expressed his great pride in the fact that Lucian Dobrzycki had revealed in a family history that he had done for Koch that his great-great-uncle was a horse thief in Poland. And I don't know why he mentioned, I didn't know why he mentioned it, but it was clear that he took great pride in the fact that he had a page in Jewish history. The fear that this kind of information was going to turn out badly for Jews was well-founded. It wasn't just that Jews were social climbers and were being held back by these kinds of people. The police commissioner of New York in 1905 said that Jews constitute 20% of the population and 50% of the crime. The American Jewish Committee made him take it back, but that's what he said, and everybody knew it. At the same time, the people who published this, the publishers, wanted to sell newspapers. And this was a guilty pleasure. And it's great fun to read.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they kept publishing it for that reason, partly because it was in a secret language.
Right. That's true. And it's interesting what you say about Koch. Is a few years ago I did an exhibit here called Yiddish Fight Club that featured. Thank you. That featured a lot of Jewish professional wrestlers and boxers from before World War II. And in the wake of that, I had people emailing me and coming to my office with photos of their older relatives who had been professional wrestlers and boxers. And it was as if they had no venue to talk about this type of thing. They took pride in it, but they said that, I never had a way to talk about this in a Jewish context. So yeah, it does. I think that people do, enjoy this sort of thing.
When Alana spoke to you about present-day Jews and bad behavior, I was thinking to myself that there are Jews in the press who are exhibiting bad behavior today, but they're not of the low, poor class. So that doesn't fit into your category. Is that
right? I mean, it fits into a category, just not
your category?
Just not my category.
I salute the gentleman behind me who was talking about all the press and remind people that there was a lot of product, a lot of pages to fill. And these were competitors. We got to fill those papers because we can't only have advertising. The question
God
was,
forbid, right.
the question that was asked earlier was, what are people writing today? They were talking about the granularity. I was reading an article today talking about how newspapers are shrinking, how once upon a time there would be a Staten Island bureau for the news, for the Times or for the Post or for the Daily News, where there isn't today. When DNA Info was folded, when the Gothamist folded, the granularity has been disappearing. Where is the type of gossipy story that we're talking about here today? It can't be in the English press. It's not in the Yiddish press, which is shrunk to next to nothing. It's in the ethnic press of languages we're not even thinking of. These are what the immigrants are up to, what the Jews were up to 80 years ago. Those working class people speaking a language that only they speak. That's where the coverage is. That's where these stories are happening.
It may be true. I don't know these languages, and I don't know if. That's why. and the Jews are known to be extremely self-reflexive and self-critical. So and also the Yiddish press was the largest immigrant press in the history of the United States. So you do have significant content there. Possibly more than what you have in other languages.
Eddie, yeah, you mentioned about drag queens. I'm curious. In all your research, was there much gay stuff back then?
Wait, I'm sorry, say that again?
You mentioned about drag queens.
Yeah.
Any gay stuff back there?
Actually, you know what? There's not a lot of material on gay life. Obviously, it wasn't something that was at all out in the open. There is an instance of an episode in Poland or in Warsaw where in sometime in the 1920s, it's discovered that a young man has stolen all his mother's jewelry, and not to sell but to wear. And what the police discover is that they discover a fake ID factory for gays in order to give fake IDs to the police if they were arrested, because it was illegal to be gay in Poland at this time. So I haven't found a lot, but it's the drag queen thing is there were lots of performances. Drag was not that unusual. There was one particular drag queen on which a feature was done in the early 1930s. As it happens, he was from Palestine. His name was Meyer Arber, and he was a well-known drag queen who was born in pre-state Palestine and migrated to Europe in order to perform. And there are advertisements and blurbs about his performances. But other than that, it's you see advertisements, but you don't see a lot written about it.
What can you tell us about the intriguing, rather large figure in back of you that's on our program?
Okay, this is Martin the Blimp Levy, who was an allegedly 625-pound professional wrestler. His career started in the mid-late 1930s, and he was a protege of Yankov Pfeffer, or Jack Pfeffer, who was a wrestling impresario in New York, who had a stable of Jewish wrestlers. And he discovered Martin at working as the fat man at a circus sideshow. And Pfeffer's specialty was bringing in freakish characters into professional wrestling, and the Blimp is one of them. Pfeffer's also a very interesting character. He's also responsible for having outed wrestling as a sport with predetermined outcomes. And he's known to have fed sports writers with the winners and losers of wrestling matches before they happened.
My question is, well, when we read these stories from a distance, they're hilarious, they're colorful, we enjoy these characters. But I'm perplexed by this. When Jews act badly today, including rabbis, we feel shame, we feel remorse, we feel horror. Now, granted, the stories that you write about have the protection of Yiddish. They're in family. But I have a feeling that, and I wonder how you feel about this, that for us today, when we're ashamed of Jews acting badly, it's not just that we're ashamed in front of outsiders. We feel bad that this is happening.
Sure,
Is there some?
Any tragedy is terrible, but one of the things that's happening here is the concept of tragedy plus time equals comedy. You have a sufficient distance that allows you to you have a sufficient historical distance and also a cultural distance. I think that part of what's happening here is that you don't expect Yiddish-speaking Jews to behave this way, and that's one of the twists that helps it become funny. It's not that it's any less tragic, but the distance, the cultural and historical distance allows for that. Okay, we'll take one more question.
Last question? Okay. Did you find in your research that many of the Jews that you came across in these stories engaged in Ponzi schemes, either involving their own families or others, probably not on the scale of Bernie Madoff, obviously, but was that a conspicuous element?
You know, that's an interesting question. I'm sure it exists. In my research, I did not come across Ponzi schemes specifically. But I'm sure if I continued looking, I would doubtlessly find them. Doubtlessly. I just want to add that we're going to have a book signing outside. So if you'd like to purchase the book, it would be very nice, but you don't have to. No one's gonna twist your arm. But they're available outside, and I will be happy to sign. I'd like to thank Luke Sant and Alana Newhouse for participating, and thank you for coming.